Former governor of Massachusetts and presidential candidate Deval Patrick, great to be with you.
Good to be with you, Ian. Thank you for having me.
So much to talk about. We're at a very remarkable moment of American history. Protests blanketing the country in the midst of a global pandemic. Certainly not where any of us thought we were going to be at the beginning of the year. I have to start this off by asking you what you think these protesters and the leadership of the Black Lives Matter movement should be demanding at this moment.
Well, first of all, I want us all to share in the gratitude that I have to them, because I think in addition to calling attention to police excesses, so many more of which occur without being videotaped than the horrific ones we have seen. They are also calling attention to what the lasting and pernicious issue that underlies so much of police culture and so much, frankly, of our criminal justice system, of our healthcare system, our housing, our education systems. And that is the ways in which we have gotten accustomed to the devaluing of Black life.
It's one of those rare bipartisan issues in Washington, criminal justice reform. So, when you look at what's happening right now across this country, I mean, this isn't one or two cities, not one or two states. Do you have any optimism that things can quickly get better? And where would you point to likely progress if we were to get the agenda right?
So, Ian, I am cautiously optimistic. I am by nature optimistic, but I do think that the protests have brought a certain urgency to these issues that we don't always see. I think the bipartisan support has mainly been around sentencing reform, which is critically important. The warehousing of people and the failure to prepare the 95+% of folks who are in to be out again one day and back into productive and mainstream life is enormously important. Policing is a sub-part of that. We have not had bipartisan support for that, at least in a very public way until now.
We are seeing people of all stripes showing up at these demonstrations and protests. At the same time, there is a pandemic on. So last week and a half, we've seen very little of Dr. Fauci, of Dr. Birx. How do you deliver a message like that without undermining both the pain and the progress that is at stake here?
Very, very gingerly. I mean, it's we've had, my wife is a cancer survivor. She's recovering not quite even 2 years now. I have felt like I wanted to be present and witnessing protests personally. And she's basically said, not if you want to come back home afterwards.
For a couple weeks. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. Because we all have to care about her health, and I think people are making those kinds of judgments all over the country. We're also at the same time, I think, just on a human level, if I may say, Ian, we're hungry for the company of other people. We're hungry for connection and community under any circumstances, but especially after a couple months of being self-isolated in this way, and to come together around something as meaningful as the current issues, I think is enormously important. Trying to be socially distant under those circumstances, it's gratifying to see so many of the protesters wearing masks, but not all do. And it is tough when you're being, herded behind police riot gear to stay 6 feet apart.
So we see one of the biggest expressions visible from space in Washington, D.C., a massive mural on the street saying Black Lives Matter, put out there by the D.C. mayor. And then the next day after that says, defund the police.
Mm.
And we see in Minneapolis as well, city council coming out with agreement to fund the police. Well, everyone talking about this. Obviously, a lot more controversial than Black Lives Matter.
Mm.
What do you think about that message as a rallying cry for many that are out there on the streets and are leading this movement right now?
I get it, Ian. I'm not there yet personally. I mean, I have a little bit, to be honest, the reaction I did to the calls to abolish ICE. Someone has to do that job. And to me, more to the point is, how do we get policing right? Um, I understand the slogan. I understand what it points to. But what I want is to be able to count on the police to build real relationships with community, to be a source of safety and order, and not just a source of control and in many cases violence. There are lots of really great rank and file police officers, and I think it is meaningful that so much of law enforcement leadership has spoken up in support of the protesters and in support of the points that they're making. So I want us to be able to rely on responsible and modern policing that emphasizes restorative justice and de-escalation and community building. But I take the point that there are reasons behind the desperation people feel in lots of American communities. Um, those are experiences, as I say, Black communities have had and felt for generations, but now many, many more communities are feeling that. And until we get at that and invest in the kinds of responses that alleviate and ultimately eliminate those kinds of anxieties and stresses and trauma, then it will not be enough um, simply to train police officers how better to de-escalate. I think that may be how I sense what the slogan "Defund the Police" is getting at.
Now, there are a lot of people that are debating today the issue of structural racism. A lot of white people coming out and saying, yeah, there's racism in the United States. There are a lot of individuals that act in a racist way, and we need to do something about that. And very few people trying in any way to justify what was behind that video that we all saw in Minneapolis. And then in the Black community, you have a lot of people saying, no, you don't get it. This is actually about a system that is institutionally racist against people of color. Deval, how do you talk to people to try to bring them together when the divisions about the nature of the problem are that fundamental?
Well, we've never been able to have this conversation very well, I think, in America. Sometimes it feels like we divide between those who say, we've made profound change. Look at all that happened in the '60s, and we're done. And those who say we are in the same place we were, at the end of slavery. I've heard some rhetoric that we are the same as we were in slavery. In fact, both are true in the sense that we have made extraordinary progress, much of it in my lifetime, by the way, in the access, the freedoms, the equality and opportunity of Black and Brown Americans. But we have a lot to do. And it isn't always manifest in the violence visited upon George Floyd and incidents like that, although it is. And anxiety about that is something that every parent of a Black child thinks about and talks about with their kids. But there is a lot more to this, Ian, that gets at what my wife sometimes describes as the indignity du jour. The notion that you expect, especially if you're driving a nice car in a so-called white neighborhood, that you're going to be pulled over. The numbers of times you're called the N-word or something else, sometimes by people who think they're joking. You know, I have given up going to baseball games and football games because I just don't want to have to listen to some drunk fan calling the players the N-word or ape or something like that. I just don't want to hear it. I remember being stopped by a state trooper while sitting in the passenger seat of a black SUV with a black driver when I was governor of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Now, the driver happened to be a plainclothes state policeman. I was governor. It was a rookie state trooper, as far as I could tell, but he still, when he stopped us and asked, he couldn't quite process what this scene he was seeing.
I mean, that's like, I'm sure a lot of our viewers right now are looking at this and saying they can't even compute it. Like, how is it possible that someone of your status, your success, would feel that way? And I think that's what we're trying to get through. And I'm just wondering, I mean, how much of that is front of mind for you just every day?
I had forgotten that story until the white staffer who was remained close to me reminded me that he was sitting in the back seat when that happened. And I think in some ways there's a device, there's a tool you develop where you just learn to put it down and keep moving. Not everybody, but to put it down and keep moving. You know, racism is not my problem, it's white people's problem. The impact is on me, but the work to overcome it, the work to see that it is more than being called an offensive word that cuts, that belongs to others.
So we've now seen President Trump's response to these protests.
I am your president of law and order.
Obviously, incredibly divided times in the U.S. Have you been surprised by anything that's come out of the White House at this point? Anything? How do you? So let you react to it.
You know, Ian, I'm old-fashioned, I guess I would say, in the sense that I don't actually want the American president to fail. You know, he wasn't my pick. He's not my party, but he is our president. And I wanted to be surprised, but I wasn't. We are cursed with the worst possible leader for the circumstances we are in. And I would have said that about COVID-19 and still do. This is a time when we need, as I said, to turn to, not on each other. When we need empathy, when we need understanding, those things can live alongside being firm. And when we need, a willingness to think about others and not just yourself. And this president has shown time and time again, he is incapable of thinking beyond himself at any given time. So, yeah, I wish I'd been surprised, but I haven't been. And the notion that a repeatedly lawless and chaotic president would call for law and order and describe himself as your law and order president was just almost laughable.
Now, after you pulled out of your presidential bid, you launched a PAC to support Joe Biden, 77 years old, white guy, supported the 90s crime bill, and has made a lot of missteps, gaffes, when it comes to talking about race. I'm sure you've got your talking points down, but just give me like a little informal bit.
So the first thing
about like why you think he's the right guy.
No, it's fair. It's a fair point. First of all, just to be clear, Together Fund is not just about the Biden campaign. In fact, it's not even just about this election cycle. It's about encouraging and elevating the values of generational responsibility, of servant leadership, of community building as frames for how we make policy, and supporting candidates for the Senate and the House, as well as the president, who are willing, frankly, to lose in service of those values. And I think, look, I've known Joe Biden for a long time, and I know him to be a deeply empathetic person. I agree. He can be, you mentioned the gaffes, he can be clumsy in his public speaking and so forth. I see that. Everybody sees that. So can I. And so are other regular people. And I think he's always been growing. He's always been evolving. I love community policing as a strategy. Might be the one great thing to come from the crime bill in 1994, but there's a lot about that crime bill that may have seemed politically smart then, but that has been responsible for an awful lot of damage, direct or indirect, by setting a model that a lot of states followed around minimum mandatory sentencing. And I think he himself has said publicly, I know he has personally, that it's time to fix that. Now, having said that, I think it's incumbent on all of us to push him and to push our party to be bold, because that's what the moment demands. You know, it's one thing to campaign, Ian, with your supporters and for their support and so on. But once you get the job, you have to govern for everybody. The people who voted for you, the folks who didn't, the folks who just stayed home, sadly. And we haven't seen that in the last little while, but it is what we need going forward. And I think we have to demand that we break this old pattern of, expecting the worst from Republicans and the minimum from Democrats, but asking for a bold, unifying agenda that is enabling of people, again, in ways that this last little while hasn't been.
Deval Patrick, thank you so much. It's great to be with you today.
Good to be with you, Ian. Thank you.